The rain came sideways across the courtyard of Ravensmere Hall on the night the carriage brought the boy, and Esther Wycliffe stood beneath the stone arch of the servants' entrance, with her hands pressed flat against her apron, watching the lamps swing in the wind and praying that the man who came down the carriage steps would not look at her face. She had counted on the dark. She had counted on the livery and the lowered eyes and the simple arithmetic of a great house where a governess engaged for a single quarter was furniture that moved, no more remarkable than a chair carried from one room to another. She had counted on 6 years and a different name, and the certainty that no gentleman of his rank remembered the face of a clergyman's daughter he had known one summer in a parish too small to appear on any map a peer would trouble to read. What she had not counted on was the boy's hand finding hers in the wet dark, small and cold and entirely trusting, and the way the man turning at the carriage door went still at the sight of it, as though the gesture itself had spoken a word he half recognized in a language he could not place. She drew Walter back against her skirts. The Earl of Ravensmere came up the steps with the rain running off the brim of his hat, and for one held breath the lamplight caught his face, and Esther forgot the cold in her thin shoes and the duty she had been hired to perform, and remembered instead a hawthorn hedge in June and a letter she had burned, and the precise and ruinous fact that some debts the heart records are never afterward forgiven their interest. He did not know her. She read it in the courteous distant nod he gave the woman in grey, and she was glad of it, and the gladness sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. To understand how a governess came to stand in that courtyard, and how an earl came to bring an orphan home to a house that had wanted no children in it for years, one must go back, though not so far as the heart wishes to go, and begin with the plainest of the facts. Esther Wycliffe was the daughter of a country clergyman in the parish of Ashurst, and she had been raised in 3 rooms over a kitchen that smelled always of beeswax and old hymnals, and she had been taught Latin she was not supposed to know, and music she was permitted to perform only for God, and she had been until her 21st year. Perfectly and unremarkably happy. Her father preached mercy on Sundays and practiced it the other 6 days, and the worst thing anyone in the village could say of the Wycliffes was that they gave away more than they could spare. She had expected to marry a curate. She had expected to grow old, within the sound of the same church bell. She had expected very little, and for that reason, the summer that overturned everything arrived without any warning at all. The Earl of Ravensmere had been that summer a younger son with no expectation of the title, a man of 27, named Conran, who had come into the country to escape a London he found exhausting, and a mother who found him disappointing. He had a way of standing very still when he listened, as though the speaker's words were the only sound in a quiet room, and he listened to Esther across her father's garden wall for the better part of 3 weeks, before either of them admitted that the listening had become something neither of them could afford. He was tall and broad through the shoulders. With dark hair he wore unfashionably plain and grey-blue eyes that went the color of slate when the light left them, and a faint white scar through the outer edge of his left eyebrow from a fall in boyhood, and a habit of pressing his thumb against that scar when he was deciding whether to speak. Esther had learned that habit the way one learns a tune without meaning to, until she could not unlearn it. She had been a fool, she told herself afterward, 1,000 evenings afterward. She had been 20 years old, and a clergyman's daughter, and she had let a lord's younger son walk in her father's orchard, and she had believed him when he said that rank was an accident, and the heart was not. What she had not known, that summer, was that a younger son can become an earl in the space of one bad winter, when a brother takes a fever in Lisbon and does not recover, and a father's heart fails at the news. What she had not known was that the woman who had found her son disappointing in London would find a clergyman's daughter in Ashurst a great deal more disappointing still, and would act with the cold efficiency of a woman protecting an order she believed God himself had ordained. Lady Theodora, the Dowager Countess of Ravensmere, was not a wicked woman. It is important to be exact about this, because the easy story is the false one. She was a woman of 70, who had buried a husband and an elder son in the same year, and watched the whole weight of the name come down upon a younger boy she had never expected to carry it, and she had decided, in her grief and her certainty, that she would not see the title squandered on sentiment. She was small, and very upright, with white hair dressed in the fashion of her youth, pale eyes that missed nothing, and a voice that could deliver a cruelty so wrapped in courtesy that the wounded party often thanked her for it. She loved her surviving son with a love that had narrowed, over the years, into something almost indistinguishable from control. And so, in the months after Conran came into the title, when his letters to a parsonage in Ashurst grew warmer rather than cooler, the dowager did what she believed a mother must. She did not rage. She did not forbid. She intercepted. She had a footman she trusted, and a steward who owed her his place. And between them, the letters that should have crossed the country in those crucial weeks did not arrive, or arrived, altered, or arrived too late to mean what they had meant when they were written. To Conran, who waited at Ravensmere for word, it appeared that Esther had gone silent, and then at last had returned his ring by the hand of a stranger, with a single cold line. To Esther, who waited at the parsonage growing daily more afraid of a thing she could not yet name aloud, it appeared that the Earl of Ravensmere, having got what younger sons get from clergymen's daughters, had remembered his rank and forgotten his promises, exactly as her father's grimmest parishioners had always warned that such men did. She did not blame him. Even then, that was the cruelty of it. She read the cold line in what she believed was his hand, and she folded it small, and she thought with a calm that frightened her, that he was right to choose his name over her, and that she would not have respected him if he had chosen otherwise. She was carrying his child, and she did not write to tell him so, because she would not buy a man with a son, and because she believed, having read the letter, that he would not have come. What she did not know was that the letter was not in his hand at all. Her father died that autumn, before the worst of it could be hidden from him, and Esther was glad of one mercy at least, that he died believing her engaged. For the dowager, having separated the lovers, was not careless enough to leave a disgrace to ripen on her son's doorstep. She arranged things. There was a man in Tilbrook, a surgeon's mate lately invalided out of the Navy with a wound that would not heal and a few months left to live. A decent and dying man named Brockton, who had no family and a small naval pension that would lapse unclaimed if he died unwed. The dowager steward made the arrangement, and the dowager's money smoothed it, and Esther, with her father in the churchyard and a child coming and nowhere on earth to go, married a stranger in a registry office in Tilbrook, and gave her son, when he came, the name of a man who held him exactly twice before the wound finished its work. So, Walter was born a Brockton, and his true father did not know he lived, and his mother did not speak the truth to a living soul, and the order that Lady Theodora had protected stood firm and unbroken for 6 years. You may wonder, as you listen, why a woman would carry such a silence so long. The answer is the plainest one. She carried it because the truth would have ruined her son before it freed him, and because she had learned in a poor parsonage that gave away more than it could spare, that the world does not weigh a woman's love against a woman's situation. It weighs only the situation. So she taught French and pianoforte in other women's houses, and she moved, when the questions came too close, and she kept her son fed and clean and laughing. And she told herself that this was enough, and most days she almost believed it. Then Brockton's name, dead these 6 years, surfaced in a place she could never have foreseen, and the careful arithmetic of her silence began, very quietly, to come apart. It happened by way of the Earl himself, though he did not know it. Conran of Ravensmere had become, in the years since that summer, precisely the cold and exacting man the county believed him to have always been. He had married no one. He had buried himself in the management of an estate that did not need so much management, and he had let his mother arrange his dinners and his acquaintances and very nearly his life, and he had stopped, at some point he could not have named, expecting to be happy. The county said he was proud. The county was wrong. But the county had no way to know it, because the man gave it nothing to correct the impression. He had served briefly in a volunteer capacity during the war years, more administration than soldiering, and through that service he had come to know the names of men who had given more than he had and received less. When a charitable society for the relief of naval orphans applied to him, as it applied to every titled man in the county, he gave more than was expected, and asked, unlike most such men, to see where the money went. And in a ledger of fatherless boys placed out to trade or kept in want, He found a name that meant nothing to him, and a circumstance that did. A surgeon's mate named Brockton, dead of a service. Wound, leaving a widow who supported the boy by teaching, and a son of 6 in want of a gentleman's notice. He could have signed a draft and turned the page. 100 men did exactly that. Conran did not, and he could not afterward have told you why, except that the word widow had caught on something in him the way a thread catches on a rough nail, and the word son had caught on the rest of it. The long ache he never examined, the children he would not have, the name that would die with him because he had not been able to make himself want anyone after Ashurst. He wrote to the society. He proposed to take the boy as his ward, to school him and settle him, and to engage the mother, if she were respectable, in some capacity in his own household, that the child need not be parted from her. It was generous. It was also, though he would have denied it, with his whole cold heart, the only warm thing he had let himself do in 6 years. He never met the widow before she came. The arrangements were made through the society, and the steward, the references taken, the terms set, and the woman engaged as governess, sight unseen on the strength of a parish character that praised her learning and her conduct and named her, in the careful hand of a society clerk, as Brockton of no fixed parish. Mabris. And so it was that on a night of sideways rain, the Earl of Ravensmere brought home a stranger's heir and a hired governess, and did not know that he had brought home his own son and the only woman he had ever loved. The first weeks were a held breath that would not release. Esther learned the house the way she had learned every house, by its bells and its tempers and its hours. She kept to the schoolroom and the nursery wing. She took her meals apart. She taught Walter his letters and his sums and the names of the kings, and she watched, with a vigilance that never slept, for the moment the Earl would look too long at the boy's slate-colored eyes or the boy's dark hair, or the particular way the boy pressed his small thumb to the place above his eyebrow when he was deciding whether to speak. For the boy had the gesture, he had always had it, since before he could have copied it from any living soul. And Esther had spent 6 years pretending not to see it. Mrs. Mess. Honeywell the housekeeper took to the governess at once, which Esther had not expected and could not afford. She was a wide, warm woman, who had served the family 30 years, and disapproved of exactly one person in it, without ever saying so, and she fell into the habit of bringing the governess a second cup in the small parlor off the kitchen of an evening, and talking, as housekeepers will, of the house and its history and its silences. He was not always so shut, Mrs. Honeywell said one night of the Earl, with her hands folded around her cup. There was a summer, years back, before the old lord and the young one died so close together. He came home from somewhere in the country, lit up like a window at Christmas. Then it all went dark in him and stayed dark. His mother says it was the grief of the title. I served his mother near as long as I've served him, and I'll tell you, Mrs. Brockton, grief does not work the way she says it works. Grief does not last 6 years in a man who has nothing to be sorry for. Esther looked into her cup and said nothing, and her heart beat in her throat like a thing trying to be let out. The dismissive line, Pradden, when it first came from the dowager. Lady Theodora arrived from the dower house within the fortnight, as Esther had known she must, and she came into the schoolroom unannounced one morning while Walter was at his sums, and she looked at the governess for a long moment with her pale, missing, nothing eyes, and she did not recognize her. And Esther understood in that instant that she had never been a face to this woman at all, only a situation, and that the situation had been managed and forgotten. "You are the naval person's widow," Lady Theodora said. "It was not a question. My son has a weakness for charity. I find it expensive and untidy, but he is the Earl and may indulge himself. You will keep the child to the nursery wing. A great house is not a place for a fatherless boy to forget his station, and it is a kindness to him in the end to teach him what he is. Yes, my lady," Esther said, and curtsied and kept her face still. "He has a look about him," the dowager added, pausing at the door, and for one terrible heartbeat, Esther's whole body turned to glass. "A common boldness in the eye. You will correct it. boldness in his class becomes insolence. In his betters, it becomes something else. But he has no betters to lend it to. She went out. Esther sat down because her legs would not hold her, and Walter looked up from his slate and asked her why her hands were shaking, and she told him she was cold, and that was the first lie she told inside the walls of Ravensmere Hall, and it was not the last. The Earl, meanwhile, had begun to do a thing he could not account for. He came to the schoolroom. He told himself it was duty, the natural interest of a guardian in his ward, and he came at the awkward hours of a busy man, before dinner, with the day's dust still on him, and he stood at the back of the room with his hands behind him, and watched the boy read. Walter was not shy of him. That was the first thing that unsettled the Earl, who was used to children going quiet and careful in his presence. This one looked up at him with frank, fearless eyes, and showed him a sum, and asked him whether an Earl had ever been a soldier, and the Earl, who had armored himself against every assault society could mount, found himself entirely unarmed against a question about soldiering from a boy of 6. He began to stay longer. He brought the boy a wooden horse, then a book of maps, then, one evening, a small brass telescope from his own boyhood, and he taught Walter to find the moon's craters from the schoolroom window, the two dark heads bent together at the glass. And Esther stood by the cold hearth with her hands knotted in her apron, and watched the two of them, and thought she would not survive it, this nearness, this thing she had wanted for both of them for 6 years, and could never name. It was at the telescope that he first felt the wrongness, though he could not yet read it. The boy pressed his thumb to the place above his eyebrow, frowning into the eyepiece, deciding whether to ask his question, and the Earl, watching, felt the gesture go through him like cold water, and did not know why, and put his hand up without thinking, and pressed his own thumb to the white scar in his own brow, and stared at the back of the boy's dark head and felt the floor of his certainties shift a 1/4 inch beneath him. He said nothing. He went down to dinner and sat across from his mother and could not eat, and his mother asked him if the charity boy was tiring him, and said, with that rapt courtesy of hers, that a guardian's interest was admirable, but a guardian's affection was a folly. The boy would only have to be cured of later. And the Earl looked at his mother across the candles, and felt for the first time in years that he did not entirely know her. The rival arrived in the new year, because the Dowager had decided it was time. Lady Helena Crawford was the daughter of a marquess, and the answer to a question Lady Theodora had been asking for a decade, which was, how to settle the succession on a man who refused to settle it himself. She was 24, golden and accomplished, and genuinely kind in the way of people who have never once been made to suffer for kindness. And she had been told in 100 small ways since girlhood that she was the correct choice, and she believed it without arrogance because no evidence had ever contradicted it. She came to Ravensmere for a long visit with her aunt as chaperone, and she played the harp beautifully in the gold drawing-room, and she was patient with the Earl's silences, and she would have made the whole county agreed. An excellent countess. Esther watched the carriage arrive from the schoolroom window with Walter's small hand in hers, and she felt the future close like a door in a draught, and she told herself that this was right, that this was the order restoring itself, that she had no claim. She told herself this firmly, and well. Well, then Lady Helena, crossing the courtyard, looked up and saw the governess and the boy in the window, and smiled at them. A real smile, unguarded and warm, and Esther's resolve broke against that kindness more cleanly than it would ever have broken against cruelty. And she turned from the glass with her eyes stinging, and set Walter to his copying, and did not let him see her face. The Earl did not fall in love with Lady Helena. He was courteous to her, and grateful for her patience, and he sat beside her at dinner and listened to her harp, and the whole machinery of the thing rolled forward on rails his mother had laid, and a quieter man might have let it carry him all the way to the altar out of sheer exhausted civility. Yet he had begun to come to the schoolroom not for the boy alone now, and he had begun to notice the governess, and the noticing had the quality of a thing remembered rather than discovered, which frightened him because he did not believe he had ever seen her before in his life. She would not look at him directly. That was part of it. Every other woman in the county arranged her face to be seen by the Earl of Ravensmere. This one arranged hers not to be. And the effort of it, the discipline of it, drew his eye the way stillness draws the eye in a room full of motion. He found himself memorizing the line of her lowered profile. He found himself listening for her voice in the corridor. One afternoon he came upon her at the schoolroom, pianoforte playing for the boy. A small air she did not know was overheard, and the air stopped him in the doorway with his hand on the frame, because he had heard it once before, long ago in an orchard, played on a worse instrument by a girl whose face he had spent 6 years trying not to see. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor until the music ended, and then walked away with his heart going hard, and he told himself he was tired. And he did not sleep that night at all. The body knows before the mind consents to know. That is the oldest truth in any house where a secret is kept. The thing came apart over a miniature. It was a small thing, an oval of painted ivory in a worn silver case, and it had been Esther's mother's. And inside it was not Esther's mother but a lock of fair child's hair, and behind that, folded to the size of a thumbnail, the only thing she had kept from that summer, but a single pressed hawthorn flower, gone brown as old paper. She kept the case in her workbox, and she should not have kept it at Ravensmere, and she had kept it because a woman who has given up everything keeps one thing, or she does not survive. Walter found it, as children find everything. He was not a sly child, only a curious one, and he came to the Earl at the schoolroom window one gray afternoon, with the silver case open in his palm, having got it from his mother's basket while she fetched his clean shirt, and he said, "Look, the lady's flower is broken," and held it up, and the Earl looked. He knew the case. He had held it in an orchard. He had watched a girl open it to show him a pressed flower he had given her from a hedge in June, and he had thought, with the whole foolish certainty of 27, that he would marry the girl who kept his flowers in her mother's silver. The schoolroom went very quiet. The Earl took the case from the boy's hand, with fingers that were not steady, and he looked at the brown flower, and he looked at the lock of fair hair, that was the boy's own infant hair, though he did not yet let himself understand it. And he looked up, and Esther was standing in the doorway with the clean shirt over her arm, and her face the color of ash. And at last, after 6 years, after a courtyard and 100 schoolroom afternoons, the Earl of Ravensmere looked at his governess and saw her. He said her name. Not Mrs. Brockton. Her name, her own name, the name from the orchard. And it came out of him low and broken and disbelieving, and it was the first time in 6 years that anyone had spoken it aloud, and Esther put her hand against the doorframe to keep from falling. "Send the boy out," she said. It was all she could manage. He sent the boy to Mrs. Shree, Honeywell with the telescope as an excuse, and when the door closed, the two of them stood in the schoolroom with 6 years and a courtyard and a worn oval of silver between them, and the whole false architecture of the silence came down at last. Not in a flood, but in pieces. A question and an answer and a longer silence and another question, until the shape of what had been done to them stood plain in the cold room, and neither of them could pretend any longer not to see it. He had not abandoned her. She heard it in his voice, and she believed it, against 6 years of careful certainty, because the man before her was not lying and had never learned to. He had written. He had waited. He had received a cold line in a hand he had believed was hers, returning his ring, and he had grieved her as one grieves the dead, and had never married, because he could not make the orchard release him. And she had read a cold line in a hand she had believed was his, and had married a dying stranger to give his child a name, and had taught French in other women's houses for 6 years, rather than buy him with a son. And the boy at the telescope, the boy with the gray-blue eyes and the thumb pressed to the brow, was his. He sat down. The Earl of Ravensmere, who had not been seen to lose his composure in the memory of any servant living, sat down on the small schoolroom chair that was sized for a child, and put the small case in his 2 hands, and bent over it. And Esther crossed the cold room and stood before him, and did not touch him, because a governess does not touch an earl. Because 6 years of discipline do not dissolve in an hour, and because she did not yet know whether the seeing of her was the end of her suffering or the beginning of a worse kind. "Whose hand was it?" he said at last, not looking up. "On the letter you read. You said it was cold. Whose hand?" "I thought it was yours," she said. "It was not mine." He turned the case in his fingers. "And the line you sent me, returning the ring. That was not your hand either. I have looked at your hand on the boys' copybooks for 3 months, and told myself I was imagining a thing I could not name." He looked up then, and all the slate had gone out of his eyes, and left them only dark with grief. "There were 2 false letters, Esther. Yours to me, and mine to you." A forgery does not write itself, and it does not deliver itself, and it does not lapse conveniently silent for 6 years. Someone did this. Someone in this house did this. And in the dower house that evening, the Dowager Countess of Ravensmere learned from a frightened footman that the charity widow and the painted oval had undone in an afternoon the work of 6 careful years. And she set down her teacup very precisely, and she did not faint, and she did not weep, and she began, with the cold competence that had never yet failed her, to plan her defense. This is the part of the story the easy telling leaves out. A defeated antagonist is not one who crumbles at the first reverse. Lady Theodora did not crumble. She had not protected the order of her house for 50 years by yielding ground the moment it was contested, and she understood, sitting alone in the dower house with her cold tea, exactly what she stood to lose and exactly which weapons remained to her. She moved first, and she moved hard. Within the week there appeared, through the offices of a Tilbrook attorney who owed the Dowager more than he liked to remember, a marriage settlement. It named Esther Wycliffe and a gentleman of fortune, dated the spring before Ashurst, witnessed and sealed, an old engagement broken off. The kind of document that a clergyman's daughter, who had reached above her station, might be supposed to have concealed. It was a forgery and a good one, and its purpose was not to prove a true thing, but to make Esther's word worthless. For a woman who would hide one engagement would hide anything, and a woman whose word was worthless could claim no son and no earl and no place in any honest house. The Dowager had the document copied and let it be known in the careful, indirect way she had perfected that the governess was not what she seemed, and the Earl had been imposed upon by a designing person. And the county, which loved the Earl and distrusted charity, took the bait with relief, because it is always more comfortable to believe a poor woman's scheming than a great lady false. She found her witness, too. There was a woman who had served at the Tilbrook Registry in the year of the marriage to Brockton, an old servant now in want, and the Dowager's steward visited her with money, and a story already shaped. And the woman agreed to remember that the governess had married Brockton, knowing she carried another man's child, and meaning to fix the cost of it on whatever gentleman would pay. It was a lie. It was also nearly unanswerable, because the truth of those months lived only in Esther's silence and in 2 letters long since burned, and she struck at the boy. This was the cruelty that broke Esther's composure, where nothing else had, for the Dowager proposed, in a tone of pure benevolence, that the charity boy be sent at once to a naval school in the north, 300 miles distant, where fatherless sons of the service were trained up to be useful, and where she did not need to add, no inconvenient resemblance could be daily examined in a schoolroom by a man losing his head. She had the place arranged within days. She had a date set. She told her son it was the kindest thing, the manly thing, the thing his late brother would have counseled, and she very nearly carried it, because she had spent his whole life teaching him to mistake her control for her love. It was the boy's near removal that decided everything, for it forced the Earl to see, in a single, sharp light, that the gentle, obedient deference he had given his mother all his life had been the instrument of his own undoing. He did not rage at her. That was not his way, and it would not have served. He went instead to Mr. Tedder, Brakeardle, the family's London solicitor, an old dry man who had served the late Earl and had never much cared for the Dowager, and he laid the whole matter before him plainly, the orchard and the title and the 2 false letters and the silver case and the boy's inherited face, and he asked the one question that mattered, which was whether a thing done 6 years ago in secret could be proven now in the open. Mr. Bracegirdle took snuff and considered. The forged settlement could be broken, he said, if its forger could be found, and forgers leave threads. An attorney paid a hand that has written before. The coerced witness could be turned, for a witness bought once is a witness frightened always, and a frightened witness in possession of a lie sleeps badly and confesses easily to a man with patience and no need to threaten. The true marriage, however, the dying Brockton, the dates of the boy's birth, these were matters of record. And records, Mr. Bracegirdle said with the ghost of satisfaction, do not forge so easily as letters. The Tilbrook Registry would hold the date of the marriage. The Ashurst Parish would hold the date of a certain christening. And the arithmetic of those two dates, set side by side, would tell any honest man in England that the boy called Brockton had been begotten before his mother ever met the man whose name he bore. It was Esther, in the end, who supplied the thing that turned the lock, and she supplied it not from cleverness, but from the same stubborn honesty that had cost her 6 years, for she had not burned everything. The cold false line she had received, the one she had believed was the Earl's hand returning her, she had burned the night she read it, in grief. The letter she had written to him in those last desperate weeks and never sent, the one she had begun and not finished and folded away because she would not buy a man with a son, those she had kept in the false bottom of the same workbox that held the silver oval in her own hand, dated, written to a man named Conrad from a woman named Esther. Speaking of the orchard and the hedge and the flower and naming. In the last unsent letter of all, the child she carried and the reason she would not tell its father. They proved nothing of the forgery, they proved everything of the heart. And a woman's own true hand, kept 6 years against all sense, weighed in any honest scale against a settlement that had appeared in a Tilbrook attorney's strongbox, the very week the truth came out, Mr. Settle. Bracegirdle, reading the unsent letters by the schoolroom fire, while their writer stood with her hands knotted in her apron, set them down at last and looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was for so dry a man very nearly tender. "Madam," he said, "I have practiced the law for 40 years, and I have learned that the truth is generally weaker than a lie, for the lie is built to be believed, and the truth is only built to be true. Yet there are documents the law cannot break, and a woman's own grief written in her own hand and hidden where no scheme could reach it is one of them. Keep these. We will need them when she moves against you in the open, as she will and as I think she is about to." The black moment came at a dinner, which was the arena Lady Theodora had chosen, because she understood, as her son did not yet understand, that a thing made public in the right room cannot afterward be unmade. She had gathered the county. It was given out as a dinner in honor of Lady Helena, whose long visit the dowager meant to crown with an announcement her son had not authorized, and the gold drawing-room of Ravensmere was full of the people whose good opinion was the only court that judged such matters, the neighboring families, the rector. The Marquis's daughter golden at the center of it all, and innocent of every part of the design. And into this room, at the moment of her choosing, the dowager introduced the subject of the charity boy and his designing mother lightly, with that rapt courtesy, lamenting to the company the imposition that had been practiced on her too generous son by a person who had concealed a prior engagement and meant to fix a fatherless child upon an honorable. It was the third voicing of the dismissive line, and it was the worst, because it was public and it was nearly believed. And Esther, who had been summoned to the drawing-room on the pretext of bringing the boy to make his bow and then sending him safely up to Mrs. Honeywell, stood at the edge of that bright room in her plain gray gown with the whole county's eyes turning to her one by one, and felt the verdict settle over her like cold water closing over a head, and understood that she was about to be destroyed in the only court that mattered, and that the truth she carried was, exactly as the old solicitor had said, weaker than the lie built to bury it. She did not defend herself. She could not in that room without the documents, and the documents were not hers to produce. She stood very still under the weight of the county's verdict, as she had stood still under every verdict for 6 years, and she did the one thing she had always done, which was to keep her dignity when nothing else remained to her. And she looked, once, across the bright room, not for rescue, but only to see his face before the worst of it, at the man she had loved in an orchard and lost to a lie. And the Earl of Ravensmere crossed the room. He did not hurry. He crossed the gold drawing-room through the parting county and the silence that had fallen, and he did not look at his mother, and he did not look at Lady Helena, and he stopped before the governess in the plain grey gown, and he turned, deliberately, to face the room that had been about to destroy her, and he put himself between her and the verdict. And the whole bright company held its breath. What he said was short. The niche of his rank gave it all the weight it needed, and the discipline of his nature kept it from being a moment longer than the truth required. "This is Esther Wickliffe," he said, "to whom I was promised before any title came to me, and whom I mean to marry. The boy is my son." The room did not move. Into that stillness the dowager said, in a voice gone suddenly thin, that there was a settlement, that there were witnesses, that the woman had concealed an engagement, and the Earl turned to his mother at last, and his grey-blue eyes had gone the color of slate. And he said only that the settlement was a forgery drawn by a Tilbrook attorney within the month, that the witness had already that very morning confessed to Mr. Grey, Bracegirdle, the money she had been paid and the lie she had been given, and that the dates of a marriage in Tilbrook and a christening in Ashurst were matters of public record, which any gentleman present might examine at his leisure, and which told their own arithmetic. He did not raise his voice. He did not humiliate her beyond the displacement her own overreach had earned. He laid the truth in the bright room the way a man lays a card he has held a long time, face up, finished. The Dowager Countess of Ravensmere stood at the center of the county's gaze and felt the order she had protected for 50 years turn under her feet, and she did not faint, and she did not weep, but something went out of her upright small figure that did not afterward come back, and she said in a voice that fragmented on the last word, that she had only ever meant to protect the name. And her son looked at her with a grief that was not anger, and said that she had nearly destroyed the only thing in his life worth protecting, and that he would forgive her in time, because she was his mother, and because mercy was a higher thing than rank, but that she would not again arrange 1 hour of his life. It was Lady Helena who ended the long silence, and she ended it with the same unguarded kindness with which she had once smiled up at a window. She crossed the room to Esther Golden, and accomplished and entirely without rancor, and she took the governess's 2 cold hands in her own, and she said, loud enough for the county to hear and take its instruction, that she could not imagine a man she would rather see happy, nor a woman who had earned it more honestly, and that she hoped to dance at the wedding. And the county, which had been ready a moment before to destroy a poor woman, took its cue from a marquess's daughter as it always took its cue from rank. And the verdict turned, and the room that had nearly buried Esther Wickliffe began, here and there, to smile. That is how the world's recognition works in such houses. It is sound in the end, but it is slow, and it arrives only after someone whose standing the world respects has shown it where to look. They were married in the spring, in the church at Ashurst, where her father had preached mercy on Sundays and practiced it the other 6 days, and where the same bell she had expected to grow old within the sound of rang out over a wedding no one in the village would have dared to predict. She wore no great gown. She had never wanted one. She walked up the aisle of her father's church on the arm of old Mr. Rocks, Bracegirdle, who had asked dryly for the honor, and the Earl of Ravensmere waited for her at the altar, where her father had once stood, and Walter sat in the front pew between Mrs. Hasty. Honeywell, the rector, with the brass telescope clutched in his 2 hands because he had refused to come without it. She wrote some weeks after a short and stiff letter that was not an apology and was not quite not one, and asked leave to know the boy. And Esther, who had learned in 3 rooms over a kitchen that the world does not weigh a woman's love against her situation, but that a person might still choose to weigh mercy above being right, wrote back that she might come at Christmas, and meant it, and the boy was safe, and had been safe through all of it, kept to the nursery wing and the schoolroom and the warm parlor, off the kitchen, while the storm broke, over the heads of the adults who loved him, never sent north, never frightened, never once made to carry a weight that was not his to carry. He took the name that had always been his by blood, and he kept, because his mother insisted on it, and his father came to understand why, a single thing of the man whose name had sheltered him those first 6 years, a worn navel button in a small box, that he might know one day that a dying stranger had once held out a hand to a woman in trouble and asked nothing, and that such men exist and matter. On the first evening they were all three at Ravensmere together, with the announcement made and the storm behind them. The Earl found his wife at the schoolroom window in the last of the light. The boy was asleep down the corridor. The telescope stood on its little stand where Walter had left it, trained on a moon not yet risen. She was turning the silver case in her fingers. The worn oval that had undone 6 years of silence in an afternoon, and inside it the lock of fair child's hair and the hawthorn flower gone brown as old paper. The flower he had pulled from a hedge in June, and given to a clergyman's daughter who had kept it through everything the world had done to make her let it go. He came and stood beside her at the glass, not touching her, the old discipline still a habit in them both, and then, because the discipline was no longer needed, because there was no longer any reason on earth not to. He closed the small distance and took the silver case gently from her hand, and looked at the brown flower a long moment, and gave it back. Outside, the first stars came out over the dark shape of the country where they had lost each other and been found, and below them the house was quiet, and down the corridor a boy slept with a brass telescope by his bed, and Esther Wycliffe stood at the window with her husband's shoulder warm against hers, and the small silver case closed in her hand, and did not need, after 6 years, to keep her face from being seen. If their long way back to one another has stayed with you, I hope you will sit a moment with it before you go. And remember that worth waits, sometimes, longer than seems fair, to be seen by the one whose seeing sets the world right. Thank you for staying until the end.